So listening to this song sung as a sea shanty is actually a good way for us to connect again to this biblical story as just that, a darn good yarn, a story of mythic proportions where the entire world disappears under a resurgent primordial chaos. A biblical story may well be rooted in some geoclimactic events, but it also has roots in the ancient mythic tales told by neighboring Near Eastern cultures. It's actually a fascinating element of human religions around the world that flood, creation, recreation, and redemption stories can be found in almost every culture, including the sacred stories of the indigenous peoples of North America. What's common in them all, including ours, is their wrestling with the meaning and the implications for humanity and for creation when their survival is threatened by the seemingly capricious, catastrophic forces of gods and nature. And they all ask these profound questions. Do we matter? Are we safe? Is the power in and over creation cruel or benign? And how could God let this happen? Where the biblical story departs from its similar cousins is in the answers it offers for those questions. And this is where we fall down a humongous rabbit hole. Because, I'm afraid, folks, this is not the sweet children's book story we want it to be. It begins with God, who, despite having declared the work of her creation good only 6 chapters before, is now throwing this global tantrum over the moral turpitude of humanity and destroying everyone and everything except this family of Noah and those creatures who managed to be accommodated on their ark. And what's more, as you read through the story and after the rainbow fades, we'll find out that the survivors of this cataclysm are as prone to every imaginable vice that ticked God off in the first place. Now, we progressive Christian types who prefer our God to be abounding in merciful love and focusing God's energy on global justice and equity, honestly, we frankly don't know what to do with this God, or this story for that matter. Too many in Jewish and Christian interpretive traditions have glossed over the ugly bits, and there have been disastrous consequences for doing so for the planet and for the global human community. Because all too often this flood Noah rainbow saga has been used as a proof text for our own human tantrums, our ethnic persecutions, oppressive and genocidal behaviors, and wanton disregard for the well-being of creation. So folks, we have some serious biblical homework to do if we're going to be able to see this full covenant story as good news, as gospel worth living and sharing. Now, we've done the first step already, recognizing it as an ancient tale that is ethnocentric and patriarchal, with its cultural norms and theological biases that are millennia apart from our own. When we know that, we can do better then to make it prescriptive for our own behaviors. We wouldn't do that. So what we do need to do is figure out how the story is supposed to function in our faith. So please imagine it as one of those hand-me-down stories that's good enough to pass on through the generations precisely because of those questions at its core, the ones that all people anywhere ask whenever they run up against big trouble. The version of the story as we have it in our Bibles was written for a generation of descendants of Noah and Bertha Violet, long, long, long after. This was a generation barely surviving in Babylon in the 6th century before Christ. They were stateless, landless, forced laborers. And it wasn't flood that had threatened and terrified this particular generation, but rather genocidal warfare that had stripped away everything. They were no longer in their homeland, so there was no temple. There were no festivals and high holies, no large gatherings, no freedom of movement, no sense of control over health and destiny. Just those same questions. Do we matter? Are we safe? Is the power in and over creation cruel or benign? And how could God let this happen to us? The story was passed and shared all through the generations, down to the one decimated and dispersed by Rome's final destruction of Jerusalem 600 years later. The ones who were forced to flee lands that were theirs to lands where they were never welcome. It's a story that's been told by their descendants who have been forced into ghettos and onto hell-bound trains. The same questions echoing again. Do we matter? Are we safe? Is the power in and over creation cruel or benign? And why would God let this happen? Think of how this story has been passed into and through the tiny house churches of the first centuries, or the same tiny closeted churches in communist Russia or China or in Nigeria, people persecuted, wondering if they'd actually even survive, retelling and hearing in this story their questions. Do we matter? Are we safe? Is the power in and over creation cruel or benign? How could God let this happen? Think about every generation that stands in the wreckage of flood or wildfire or hurricane or warfare or untold human tragedies, great and small, who hear their questions echoed in this story. Do we matter? Are we safe? Is the power in and over creation cruel or benign? Why would God let this happen? And here, now, to this people, to our generation, who are 11 and a half months into a pandemic, cut off from the spaces and rituals of our faith, with no freedom of movement, where vaccines in Canada at least are still rarer than hen's teeth, and where viral variants signal an alarming, dispassionate cruelty. Is it any wonder that we are asking those very same questions? Do we matter? Are we safe? Is this power in and over creation cruel or benign? And why would God let this happen to us? And this sea shanty story, attempts to answer these questions with what is a radical theological possibility. God is moved. Now, going right back to the beginning, where this ancient tale is placed against its equivalent flood sagas, where the gods are eternally capricious or vindictive or simply indifferent to suffering. In our story, God regrets her anger and then grieves the loss of life that he has allowed to happen. And then God moves heaven and earth to repair, to restore, and replenish. In this story, far from being an unmoved mover, as Aristotle called the Divine One, God is the most moved mover. God cares about what happens. In this radically innovative story, God makes covenant, primarily not with us, but with God's self, and then committing to this future relationship with all humanity and all creation as creation's eternal sustainer, promising never again to destroy the earth. And this covenant God makes with God's self and with us and with all creation is sealed with a sign. And that sign is a hung rainbow. Let me correct myself. A hung bow in the sky. Midrashers, the ones who gather with me 10 days before each of these sermons, they noticed last week that the word is bow, as in bow and arrow. God hangs her instrument of wrath and violence, transfiguring it into this celestial blessing all the more beautiful for its gentle ephemerality. To all the generations left by whatever tragedy, bereft of their human-made symbols of faith, this ancient tale reminds us that no buildings of stone, no pulpits or pews are needed to be reminded of God's covenant with creation and with all humanity. That's all humanity, not just a few of us. And that this sign is simply light, refracted through the very water that once destroyed and now blesses. So I'm going to ask you what we did with our children in our Kids Zoom time this morning. Perhaps when you cannot see or cannot wait to see a rainbow, where will you look for the signs of God's covenant? Look for the dawn, or for the heart red of the sunset. Look for cardinals against the snowfall. Look at the downward arc of the COVID stats. Look for kindness that eases pain. Look for light that pierces darkness. Look for life that springs from the tomb, and for love that outlives a cross. Because in all these, our bow-hanging God answers our questions. Yes, you do matter. All creation matters. Yes, you shall be safe. In life, in death, and in life beyond death, you shall be held safe. And yes, the power in creation is strong, and at times it is cruel as well as benign. But it will not outdo the power nor the everlasting fidelity of God's sustaining love for all. Look to the rainbow. This is our God who keeps covenant. Amen.